Hello, I'm going to give you a basic demo and informational overview of the Layout Assistant plugin. Essentially, I'm just going to talk about how it works, what it can do, and how to use it. So let's get into it. To start, I want to do a very basic overview of the plugin, and then we'll go into a basic overview of variables, and then I'll kind of show you it in action. So on a whole, the plugin is primarily useful in variable-based layouts. So when we're designing with variables, given the fact that the variable system that we have living in Cirrus native design system is a little bit complex and can be hard to use, this plugin is aimed at making variable-based layouts more accessible for more designers. Up until this point, it's been a lot of solo work for me, and so there isn't a ton of documentation out there that you can reference while trying to understand the current variables that we have. And so rather than trying to document an extensive amount of knowledge and then expect designers to try to adhere to that after remembering it all, the approach that I've taken is to create a tool that essentially automates that for you. So since we've been kind of referencing variables, but we haven't actually talked about them yet, let's talk about variables. Just at a high level, what the plugin is doing is it's using 3 different levels of variable collections in tandem. It's taking our primitive tokens or variables and the primary collections that they live in to modify either at that primary collection level or at the master collection level of variable modes. So that is to say, we've got our primitive tokens, and realistically all of these are pretty much primitive tokens because they're not semantically defined for specific uses, like a card padding small size class variable is very scoped and defined in name. Right now what we have are just essentially corner radius levels 1, 2, and 3. So we're getting to the semantic application of these, but for now what we've got is essentially a couple different layers of variables that we can use to build our designs with in the meantime. So our primitive variables, the lowest level that we've got, are defining 2 things. Size class, which is pretty straightforward, small, medium, large, etc. And then hierarchy. And I've made this visual to try to help explain the fundamentals that we're using when we think about hierarchy. So you can see here we've got a nested structure. We've got a subchild frame living within a child frame, living within a parent, within a hero. And you'll notice that each one of these levels has different layout properties, and for good reason. The one that I think helps kind of like tie everything together is the corner radius, because when we think about corner radiuses and matured design systems of matured products, we think of corner radiuses that match or nest very well. So that means we've got a very small corner radius here on the most inner level of hierarchy, and then a very large corner radius here on the very top level of hierarchy. And the reason for this is because, well, visually it makes sense, right? But the formula that we use to calculate something like this is essentially the the inner corner radius matches the outer corner radius minus padding. Or if you flip that formula around, inner corner radius value plus padding of the outer frame equals the outer corner radius. But I think visually this makes a lot of sense. But this kind of helps explain why we need these different hierarchical definitions built into our variables. Because if we want to be able to use a corner radius token or variable across an entire design, we have to give it definitions of what that value is when it's nested at a certain layer or at a certain level. And so we've got this defined for corner radius and padding and spacing, because all of those things work together to form this kind of cohesive relationship at different levels of a structure. So I'm going to show you really quick the variable library just to explain a little bit more. So let's take a look at the corner radius collection. We've got different size classes separated into different variables here. So we've got standard, we've got large, medium, and small corner radius values defined at each level of hierarchy we're working with. So corner radius standard at the parent level is 24 pixels, and then at the child level it's 12 pixels, and subchild is 8 pixels, so on and so forth. And so we've got this kind of two-axis approach for sizing of corner radius values defined between the individual size classes and their variable modes. So in order to be able to use these effectively and not have to essentially change the variable that you're using every time you want to iterate a design and take a frame up or down a level of hierarchical structure, we need to create a primary variable that bakes in not only the size class but also the variable mode for the hierarchy. So we've got these primary collections here for corner radius and spacing and padding, and they all look pretty much the same, where we've got one variable in each, and we've given modes for hierarchy in the primitive, and then we've given now variable modes for size class in the primary. And so what this allows us to do is take both of those variable modes and adjust them separately with the same variable, which is nice. So that means that you don't have to swap out the variable you're using to get to a different size class, and you don't have to swap out the variable mode for the hierarchy for those different size classes. So that's why these primary collections exist and why they're useful. It just allows us to kind of be a little bit more efficient. And then if we want to be even more efficient or more standardized, so to speak, we can use the variables from this master or primary square, whatever you want to call it, collection, where we've got all three of our main layout properties existing in the same collection. And these are all calling from the primary collections. And so what this means is we can use these spacing, padding, and corner radius variables from this collection, apply it to a frame, and then change the size class of that variable set all at once. So now that we've gotten through kind of the more technical side of things, I want to show you what I think is the most fun part, which is the plugin and kind of how it works. And to do so, I'm going to show you how I would make a card like this. So just looking at this from a high level, it looks like we've got just a very simple structure here. We've got maybe 2, 3 levels of nesting, 4 if you count some of these atomic components. And so this shouldn't take a long time to create in the first place, but if we were to do this manually, you would have to go into every single one of these properties, and you'd have to search and find the variable you're looking for, and then bind it to that variable property, and then you'd have to set the mode that you'd want based on the size class you want, and then also on the level of hierarchy at which the selected frame lives within the structure of your design. So it's a lot to manage if you're doing this manually, which is the whole reason behind the plugin. So let's start building this. I've got all my content laid out here, ready to go. And after copying it, I'm just gonna create my card frame, and I'm just gonna paste in the content. So typically, I'd spend a lot of time from the get-go trying to finesse the layout to work from the start, because standard process is just kind of getting everything set up to be flexible, which means that we have to go through and do a lot of property definition while we're building. However, with the plugin, the goal is to automate a lot of that out of the workflow. And so instead of setting up all my frames and, you know, auto layout and everything like that manually, instead what I'm going to do is actually just use the suggest auto layout functionality from Figma's toolkit here. And you can see now that everything is kind of set up the way that we want it to. And we didn't put a lot of effort in, which is nice. And so after making a couple adjustments here to make sure things flex the way that I want them to, I think I'm ready to start calling up the plugin. Before I do, I'm going to rename my layers really fast with the AI feature here, just to be organized. I'm going to hide my UI, and then I'm going to call up the plugin. And with this frame selected, let's get into the setup mode. So to kind of explain what's going on in setup mode, you can kind of see a correlation here between the way that I've styled this visual and the hierarchical tags that you see here in the plugin. So what our goal in setup mode is to define the hierarchy of the current selection. And typically you would be doing this not in a vacuum like I am right now. So you would have this card and it would be living on a page, and maybe that page has a section. And depending on if that section has visual properties that the card needs to cohese with, you might make a selection hierarchically based on that. Also, you might be able to, if you had built the design up into this point using the plugin, you might be able to use the auto function over here, and it would do that decision making hierarchically for you. But since we're not in that context and we're just demoing this in a vacuum, I'm going to keep parent selected here. And now I'm going to move on to defining which variables I want to apply or bind to which properties. So if I didn't want any of them and I just wanted to rename my layer with the prefix functionality here, I could. And the way that I did that is holding down Command and Shift while clicking, and that selects or deselects all of the layout properties at once. However, since I do want my variables to be bound to some of the layout properties, I'm going to keep the ones that I want selected, including the apply to nested selection here in the middle of this configuration UI that you see here. And what this will do is when I have this selected and I press apply variables on my frame, the plugin will apply variables and bind them to the selections that I've made in this configuration panel here. recursively to the structures that exist within the active selected. So you can see now that I've got variables bound to all of the layout properties of all of the different nested layers here. So let's take a step back and look at the results compared to our reference. And off the bat, they look pretty good. Like in a typical design context, I would probably 90% of the time leave this as is. For what it's worth, the goal is to show you all of the different functionalities, so I'm not going to stop here, but this technically matches what you could expect in design system, which is really nice. And when we get to the point where we have semantic variables defined, I would imagine that the plugin might be able to do some even smarter things, like determining that this is a card based on the layer name and using those semantic tokens that are scoped and defined specifically for cards and applying them within this layout. So I digress. Since we're not there, I'm going to keep going. Let's look at this structure in the reference design. We can kind of see a little bit of variation here. We've got a little bit less padding on the outsides between the embedded notification and the card edges. And it looks like we actually have another level of nesting going on here. We've wrapped these rows in this column, and we're giving some extra padding here. And since I created this design, I know the reasoning behind it, and I'll tell you. That reason is that this embedded notification has padding applied to it as well. And so in order to improve the optical alignment of the avatar text here with the visual center of the icon, we've actually added that padding. So let's go in and try to see if we can create this content container here in our demo design. So with these 3 rows selected, I'm going to use my Shift-A hotkey. I'm going to rename this content container. And I'm going to call my plugin backup. So you can see we get the setup mode while we're on the selection, and that's because we haven't applied any variables to this yet. If I reselect my top level parent structure, you can see that since it has variables applied and bound to the layout properties, it's actually showing us a different UI here. We see the edit mode, and we see the layout property selection highlighted where the variables that are bound are. So conversely, we can see it's grayed out here, and we've got a couple different selections for our hierarchical class. I could use the child hierarchical class here if I wanted to. Since we're inside of a parent, that makes a lot of sense. I wouldn't recommend the subchild just because that breaks hierarchical structures, but in the event that you did need to use it, it is there for you. And if you're having trouble selecting one, or you just don't want to think about it, you can always click the auto option here, and what that will do is actually determine the hierarchical prefix for the layer name based on the structure that lives above your active selection. So for this, because I'm really only focused on getting these together right now, and for the sake of the demo, I'm actually going to turn off the padding and corner radius variables, and I'm just going to apply the spacing. And you'll see that now we've got this container linked up with our variables, and now we've got the same layer structure as our reference card. So you might be wondering at this point why our configuration or our edit panel looks different on this selection than it does on another selection per se. And that's because the plugin also determines whether or not the selection or the layer that you're applying variables to is structural or visual. So in this case, because we don't have any padding or corner radius applied, it's treated this as a structural container, and it's given us an extra prefix here for the fact that it's a column, right? And so with this selected, now we get to kind of reduce the amount of noise that we have to cut through in order to make editing adjustments to the variables in our column. However, with our reference in mind, I do actually want some padding, and so I did this specifically to show you how to remove or add the structural definitions to containers. So if I want to, I can actually remove the column prefix, and it calls back up our standard UI here where we see all of our different variables that have been applied. In future versions, I'm thinking it probably makes sense to keep this display up even for column layouts, so that's something we're working on. But since my goal right now is to add some padding, I'm going to select the padding options here, and I'm going to say apply variables. And it's done it for us. So now we've got our padding variables applied to this frame as well. So we talked about how these are optically aligned and how we've got some different spacing and padding between the two of these. So let's show you how we would do that. With the top level card frame selected, I'll show you kind of the different options that you have for editing the variables that have been applied to your frames. So up here, you can see we've got preset and manual editing tabs, and then we've got input selections here as well as some sliders. What this allows us to do, this UI, is shift between different size classes defined in our variables automatically in an intuitive way, rather than going and trying to select the variable modes in the panel, in the properties panel on the right hand side. We can just do it from here, which is a little bit quicker and it's a little more consistent. So let's set it to small, just because that's what this looks like it is, and take a look at what that's done. So it's affected our padding here, which is great. That's right where we want it to be. But we can also see it's affected the corner radius. And that's because this preset tab actually leverages the master collection to adjust all the variables of your selection at once. So this is setting the spacing and the padding and the corner radius to the small class size of variables all at once. However, now this corner radius nesting, it's not working for me. It doesn't look good. So I'm actually going to go and I'm going to select my manual tab to separate the values and edit them individually. So we're focused on padding, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use our padding selection here to drag it to the small size. And you can always do this by selecting an option from the drop-down as well. But if you hover over one of these values, it will expose that slider UI so that you can just kind of toggle between them. This allows us to be specific if we want, but it also gives us the ability to kind of like vibe design and just see what feels good. And in the past, I would have said that's not a great way to design because you're kind of breaking convention, or you might be. But with this plugin, now we can adhere to the variable system that's in place without having to worry about whether or not our decisions are going to make or break convention. So we've adjusted the padding here. That's looking good. And then I can see that this has also got some pretty minimal spacing as well. Comparatively, our spacing is a little bit larger. So I can actually go in and adjust the spacing as well. So that's 0, or extra small, and that's a little too close, so I'm actually going to bump it up to small. and that looks pretty good. Now with this, you can see that technically our corner radius isn't actually truly nested, and so I can actually go in and with the same mindset I can go and adjust our corner radius of our embedded notification here until it matches. And so our large class size looks like it's nesting better, and so I'm going to leave it at that. Let's move on to the padding here. I think let's try out the medium class first, just to see what it does when we adjust both the spacing and the padding at the same time. If I look at my reference over here, I can actually see that those are unequal as well. And so while this probably looks just fine the way it is, I can actually go in and I can set those individually as well. So let's set this to the small size. It's not super optically aligned. That's better. So medium looks like it's the right fit for this. And then our spacing is a little bit larger, and that feels about right. Yeah. So with all of this, if you have any comments or suggestions for the plugin, or if you just have some ideas about how you want to use this in your workflow, I would love to hear. So please reach out over Slack or email and let me know your thoughts, if you find any bugs, etc. And in the meantime, happy designing, and I hope this plugin maybe makes your life a little bit easier. Thanks.